D Subbarao joining us now. Thank you so much, Mr. Subbarao, for your time and for speaking with us here at NDTV Profit. Really appreciate it. What would you say, in your view, has been your fondest memory or that one interaction which highlighted for you the greatness of what is Dr. Manmohan Singh?
I worked with Dr. Manmohan Singh. I was a middle-level official in the finance ministry in 1991 when the transformative reforms took place. And again, I was finance secretary 15 years later, and then I became governor in 2008. One of my fondest memories of a story that I want to tell about Dr. Manmohan Singh is this, that when I was appointed governor in 2008, I went to his office in South Block to thank him for the confidence he reposed in me and for appointing me as the governor. That was a brief meeting, just about 15 minutes. And we talked about the economy, of course. We talked about his time as Secretary of Economic Affairs, my time as Secretary of Economic Affairs. We talked about living in Mumbai and Delhi. And then in about 7 to 8 minutes into this conversation, I asked him, sir, do you have any advice for me? You were governor yourself of the RBI, so you have any advice? He just smiled, demurred, and said, what advice do I give you, Subbarao? You know the country, you worked at the state level, you worked at the country level, you were finance secretary, you know the RBI. Do your best, I'm sure you'll do very well. And then we spoke for another 3-4 minutes, and then I took leave of him. I got up to go away, and then very graciously, he got up from his chair, walked around the table to escort me to the door of his office. And just as I was, opened the door was half open. He said, you asked for my advice a moment ago. I changed my mind. I just want to give you one bit of advice, which is that so far you've been, working in the government, but the RBI is a different institution. And when you go there, there's a risk that you get so immersed in numbers, money supply, credit growth, repo rate, interest rate, inflation rate, that you will forget that there are real people behind that. Just remember, keep your ear close to the ground. Remember that whatever you do, there are people behind that who will be affected. That advice went out of my mind within half a minute as I walked out of his office. But when I started working in the RBI, in the first 6 months, I realized the import of his advice. What he was really telling me was that, take care of inflation. Inflation is a regressive tax. It hurts poor people. That is the primary mandate of the Reserve Bank. Take care of that. And I was deeply touched by his insight as well as his giving that advice to me.
Wow. Mr. Subbarao, sir, thank you so much for sharing such a moment, such a moving moment, and for him to do that, to rethink, to come back. And I'm sure as much as it held you in good stead, you would have passed on some similar advice to people after you as well, and it would have held them in good stead. I would just love to understand from you, sir, that you, of course, held the office of the RBI governor, as did Dr. Singh, and therefore some of his actions that would have been taken would have been the first amongst equals for you. But if you look at all the actions as a finance minister, in the position of the Reserve Bank and the government eventually, what stands out most for you? Is it, the easy answer could be the 1991 reforms. Is there something beyond that which was probably as tall a decision that is probably not spoken about as much?
Well, certainly the 91 reforms were transformative. We would always associate them with Dr. Manmohan Singh and, of course, the Prime Minister, P.V. Narasimha Rao at that time. So when you think of Dr. Manmohan Singh, you, of course, think of reforms. But we must remember also that in the next decade, he became Prime Minister. He was Prime Minister for 10 years. And I think he had made enormous contribution, both outside of the economic sphere as well as within the economic sphere. But the contribution I remember is all the social sector legislation that had come in the MNREGA, for example, was a contribution of Dr. Manmohan Singh's time. There was the Right to Information Act, which really empowered people across the country. There was also economic reforms in the sense of single opening up FDI for single brand retail, the Land Acquisition Act, which did not get through, but lots of things that he initiated. Even the GST, for example. The GST paradoxically was initiated when Dr. Manmohan Singh was finance minister. It did not get done. He came back as prime minister, and for 10 years he was pushing it. And it got enacted in 2016, but it stood on the foundations laid by Dr. Manmohan Singh. So we owe Dr. Manmohan Singh many, many things beyond just the transformative reforms of 1991.
Dr. Subbarao, this is a bit of a tricky question, but I think it's important to address, because one of the most famous quotes of Dr. Manmohan Singh is that history will remember him in a kind of fashion. And in the last few years of his tenure in UPA too, the memes and the caricatures was all about policy paralysis, weak prime minister, etc., etc. How do you look at that phase for him and the dignity with which he carried through?
Thank you for that question, Tamana. We must understand, I don't understand the compulsions of the prime minister. I can try to, gauge them. But he was, as prime minister, he had to balance politics and economics. And what is an economic virtue is not always politically feasible. So the UPA too had lots of problems, some of their own making, some because of circumstances beyond their control. But in all this, I think Dr. Manmohan Singh acted with great dignity, with great understanding, because even in the midst of all that, he would ask me questions about what is happening at the grassroots level. For example, when I'd gone to see him once to apprise him of the policy view we were taking, suddenly out of the blue, he asked me, are banks functioning in the Naxalite extremist infected areas? I was taken aback by that question because I was already 3 years into my governorship, and it never occurred to me to ask if banks are functioning in the Naxalite infected areas. So one of the things that I remember about Dr. Manmohan Singh was, even as he was overwhelmed by political compulsions, even as he was overwhelmed by the political situation at that time, as you described, which is, people talked about policy paralysis, etc. He always had concern for what's happening around the country. He had expressed concern about, he asked me once about, in that period, he asked me about why are there so many farmer suicides in Andhra Pradesh? He thought I knew because I come from Andhra Pradesh, but the point I'm trying to get across is that even in the midst of all those political compulsions, even in the midst of a complex political situation, you always had great sympathy for what's happening at the ground level and great curiosity about understanding what's happening at the ground level.